Right. Well, this is a webinar on coaching the brain, and we're going to be concentrating on goals, neuroscience of goals. So thanks very much for joining. What I want to do here actually is, first of all, to tell you a little bit about how neuroscience is transforming coaching, to give you some value that you can use immediately in this webinar. To bring together the idea of goals, because goals is about our kind of subjective experience of wanting, and yet the brain is heavily involved in that, and in ways that we know much more about now, but can help us a lot if we understand more. I want to tell you about the course that I'm going to be doing on the neuroscience of goals. So altogether, we're going to run about 45 minutes to an hour altogether. And if you have any questions as you go along, please type them into the chat box. And then there will be a space at the end where I can answer questions. But sometimes questions will come up and you want to type them in straight away in case you forget them. Great. Okay. I think that coaching needs neuroscience now to be credible. I think that unless coaches, psychologists, trainers, consultants, whoever you like, people who are involved in changing, have some idea about how the brain works, which is basically the organ that does the changing, we're going to lack credibility. Also, because neuroscience has progressed so much in the last 20 years, it has overturned a lot of the psychological models that we may be using. And as always, I'm particularly interested in practical applications. How can we make this stuff useful immediately? Okay, so just tell you a little bit about myself. I'm an executive coach. I live in the UK, around London. I train many coaches, over 1,000 certainly, in many countries over the years. And some of you may know me as one of the directors and founders of the international coaching community. I've written 19 books altogether in over 30 languages, lots and lots of copies sold, and that makes me very happy. And one of the reasons that I write books is to learn. I only write about things that I'm interested in and I want to learn about. And the idea is that if I can do the research and write in a useful way, I can take all the work out of it for you. The reader shouldn't have to do the work because I've been through it, I've done the work, and then you can get something out of it easily. And that's a picture of the latest book, Coaching the Brain, from which the course is going to be taken from. And that candle has a particular significance, and I'll tell you about that in just a minute. So why did I get interested in neuroscience? Well, coaching does help people to think better. And it kind of begs the question, because what do we do our thinking with? The brain, of course. And we need to understand how this works. It was very interesting when I was looking around in neuroscience of goals. We're still using SMART, S-M-A-R-T, as a kind of goal setting technology. But SMART was first put forward in 1981. And I think now, nearly 40 years later, we need to take another look at that. There's certainly some value in it, but 1981, it's the equivalent of loading up your computer with an audio cassette tape, which is what I did in the 1980s when I started on computers. Programs were held in audio cassette tapes. Now, technology moves on, knowledge moves on, and we need to do that. There's an unbelievable absence at the moment of the brain perspective in coaching. We just, this amazing organ that does all of our thinking and then hides itself. It's an amazing trick. It gives us this amazing subjective experience and then it hides itself. so that we kind of think that it's all happening by magic, and it's not. It's like, you know, talking about travel and without paying any attention to how you're going to travel. And if you know more about that, you can have a better journey, a faster journey, and more likely to get to your destination. So I did a lot of the spade work on the neuroscience. I even went to New York and had a brain scan, a SPECT scan, which was extremely interesting, on the grounds that if I'm going to talk about the brain and understanding the brain, I really ought to take a look at my own first. I wasn't ill. I didn't need to. It was something that I wanted to do. I found it fascinating. And I have the multicolored photographs to prove it. So why did Andrea and I write Coaching the Brain? Well, we wanted to make the latest neuroscience research practical, useful, point to some new psychological models, and to make coaching more credible. Because it's interesting, we are more influenced unconsciously in our thinking than we think. And research shows that if you, even with a picture of the brain, say on the top of a magazine article, it immediately makes it more credible, more likely to be believed than another picture. Yeah? It's just the way that we are influenced, our brain is influenced by context. So here's the quote. I said something about the candle and the flame there on the cover of the book. Here's the quote that it came from. This is the great American psychologist William James. So we're 100 years in the past. Nature has mixed us of clay and flame, brain and mind. The two things hang together, but how or why, he says, no mortal may ever know. Well, we're kind of getting a bit closer than he was 100 years ago, but it's still an amazing mystery. And I think of it as a candle and flame, because the candle is material. You know, it's made up of wax. It's actually mass. You know, so you can see it, hear it, feel it. It's real. It's material. And yet thought and consciousness and subjective experience is not. It's not the same domain. And yet they go together, so that the thinking needs the brain, and the brain produces the thinking. So the thought, subjective experience is the flickering, the light, the incandescence of the flame, and yet comes from the brain. Now, I'm not saying that it's just the brain. I'm not a materialist in that sense, but it seems to be true that you do need a brain in order to think and be conscious. So we need to understand more about it. So what I'm going to do is just give you a very short introduction to our friend that sits behind our eyes, and then go into, well, what does this mean for us as coaches? I'm hoping that the sound is good. I'm doing my best to make sure it is, but I can't do better than this at the moment. Okay, so here's some keys about the brain. The brain does not have likes and dislikes, or rewards or punishments. We do. It's our experience. The brain is a flickering series of pathways of electrical chemical signals. It makes no discrimination between the electrical chemical signals that carry a really stupid thought or a stupid action by our standards, and an electrochemical signal that is a really wise thought or a wise action. It's all the same to the brain. Brains are embodied, and if the body goes wrong, brain doesn't work so well. So we're not a kind of brain on a stick. We need the body to be healthy. We need our sleep. We need our exercise for the brain to work best. And anyone who neglects their physical body in the in the interests of, doing more work, thinking better, being more intelligent, is not doing themselves a service. Normal thinking, our usual thinking, is biased and not very logical. It is open to all sorts of influences, most of them unconscious, from the environment. And this is the basis of what's so-called system one thinking, which is the immediate, quick, emotional answers that we come up with in response to questions, which are very often wrong. They're too quick. We need what's called system two, which is more reflective. It comes from a different part of the brain. Most of what we do is not under our conscious control, thank goodness. We really don't want to have to think about our heart beating, our breathing, our blood pressure, or anything like that. It all happens automatically, beautifully behind the scenes. Lets us concentrate on things we want to. And we don't control our brain. But we can use it, well or badly. A few more things. 100 billion cells making a quadrillion connections. I have no idea how many zeros there are in that number, but an awful lot. I think over 30 zeros, that is. An incredible number of connections. And we know from research into neuroplasticity that the brain is constantly changing and constantly learning by growing even new neurons at any age, and continually strengthening or weakening the connections that make up our habitual thinking or our habitual actions. So the habits of thinking and the habits of actions that we do, they are all reinforced pathways in the brain, reinforced by use, like grooving into the snow. The brain's not conscious. The brain doesn't feel pain, but it translates the signals from the rest of your body as pain, which is a signal to stop doing whatever you're doing because it's not good for you. Size is not important in the brain. It's funny, there has been some research about, are the brains of geniuses bigger or different to the brains of so-called normal people? And there doesn't seem to be any evidence about that at all. The most famous case was Einstein's brain. When Einstein died in 1955, a neurosurgeon actually took it out of his skull, and it wasn't there when Einstein's body was cremated, because this particular scientist thought it would be a good idea to keep it for posterity and science, which indeed he did, and kept it at sometimes in a cider vat in a beer cooler in his garage. We were much more cavalier about things in those days. And there was some basic studies done of Einstein's brain, but really they thought maybe it had some slightly different folds, but there wasn't really anything you can say about it. So size doesn't matter. Everybody's got the same brain. It's how you use it and the connections that you use. Brain weighs about 3 pounds, but takes about 20% of the energy. It's very energy hungry. Adult brains do grow new neurons for many years, until about 15 years ago. Science thought that once you were adult, that was it. After that, it was all downhill. Your brain cells died off, and that, no way out. Now we know this is not true. We make brain cells, new brain cells, all the time, and how well your brain works depends on how you use it. Okay. I think there's two ways neuroscience can be confusing for people who don't know it. One is simply to use neuroscience to dress up the same sort of self-help ideas. Put a picture of the brain at the top of a magazine article, it becomes more credible. put a picture of the brain at the top of the usual kind of self-help models, and it may become more credible. But that's not the point. The point is to use what we know of the brain to actually refine the psychological models that we have. The other thing that you'll be glad to hear is that you don't need a detailed knowledge of brain's anatomy. Most of the brain is called in Latin names, simply because in the days when they were finding out about the brain, the scholars used Latin. So, you know, amygdala and cerebral cortex and hippocampus, these are all Latin names, which sounds kind of cool, but not really very helpful. So in terms of what we're going to be doing, you do not need to know a detailed anatomy of the brain, and you do not need to know all the Latin names. We want to be practical. So, but it's a big subject, a very big subject. And, you know, we're just really going to be able to scratch the surface as we go forward. Well, what is neuroscience? First of all, it's the study of the structure and function of the nervous system and the brain. Well, the nervous system goes throughout the body, but the brain is where it's all concentrated, and that's our main focus. Although, as I'm sure you've heard, it's kind of like the gut has its concentration of nerve cells as well, and so does the heart. But the brain has this particular part in 95% of people on the left-hand side that is able to control speech and language. And that's what gives the brain such a big advantage over the heart and the gut that cannot speak language. They speak their own language. The brain's an ever-changing part of our biology. It's involved with everything we do. Every goal we make, every emotion we have, every decision we make, it all comes from the brain. So I think it's a really good idea to get to know it as well as we can. What is coaching? Well, basically coaching is about exploring goals. What do you want? Exploring values and emotions. What's important to you? And I believe that emotions power our values. Exploring what I call our mental models, which is sometimes called beliefs, but I prefer the name mental models. In other words, what are our expectations? What are we assuming about situations? What are we predicting based on our past experiences? And then, as a result of all that, taking action. What do we do? And that's basically, for me, what coaching does. Explores goals, values, mental models in order to take the wisest action that one can, given the situation. Now, you'll notice there we have kind of goals and values, cognition and emotion. And there used to be the ancient Greeks. This was their idea of cognition and emotion. They imagined human beings like a charioteer. And the chariot was pulled by two horses. One was white and one was black. And the white horse was cognition, thinking, logic, and the black horse was emotion. So you can see immediately that there was some value judgments there. And the way that many people thought about it was that you had to steer this chariot, but the black horse was always off, off on its own way, trying to go in a different direction. And somehow the charioteer had to get these two horses to work together. But it was the black horse that was the problem. Well, we've come a bit of a long way since then, but the metaphor is an interesting one. The next slide is, I promise, the only kind of technical slide you're going to be getting. The front of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, has two main parts. One part, which is in pink there, is the part that's more concerned with what's so-called emotional thinking, hot thinking. And the other part, in purple, is more about cold cognition. But these two have to be integrated. In other words, the charioteer that integrates the two is that part in blue, the orbitofrontal cortex. And that's the part pretty much just behind the eyes. Very, very important. Without a well-functioning orbitofrontal cortex, or OFC, as it's known familiarly, then we can't make decisions. We just don't function well. So it's got to come all together. Okay. So goals then. What do we want? We are very familiar with the feeling of wanting. Yeah? And as human beings, we cannot stop that. It's what propels us into action. We want something. It's the way the brain works. We're always wanting something, short-term or long-term, trivial or very important. Now, when you come to setting goals, which are the more important and perhaps more long-term aspects of what we want, it's really quite complicated. You've got to plan it, and that's done with the prefrontal cortex, the part of the brain here, the executive functioning part of the brain. You've got to have working memory, which is known as the blackboard of the mind, where we hold ideas, concepts, actions, so that we can work on them, as it were. Keep them in mind while we manipulate other things. We need to evaluate risks that are involved. We need to evaluate threats. And we need the motivation in order to do anything at all. So it's actually pretty complex. Now, I think, from what I've read and seen, that our brains are naturally creative. You know, there's a lot of talk now about creativity and creativity strategies and how we can be creative. And I would say we are naturally creative. We can't help it. There are enemies to creativity, which can trip us up at every stage. But really, creativity is like spontaneity. You can't try to be spontaneous, because then you stop being spontaneous. You can't really try to be creative. You're naturally so, but you can make that help that creativity to flow more. One of the great enemies of creativity, of course, is habitual thinking. And we'll come on more to that in a moment. Now, when we come to planning goals, as I said, our brain is very much involved in that goal setting. The danger here is that while we can be very creative with our goals and our goal setting, once we have a good plan, it becomes real to the brain. You know, the circuits involved in the thinking and planning and considering the actions for a goal are the same, very strongly reflected in the ones that we're actually going to be using when we do it for real. Yeah? The danger is that having made a goal, the brain says, oh, great, okay, that's done. You know, we've sorted that one out. Now we'll go on to something else. And doesn't get involved in the actual doing. Yeah? And a goal is more than just setting. A goal is much more, of course, a day-to-day creating of the reality that that goal is an expression of. Okay, so just pause for a moment and continue with creativity. Creativity helps us choose. The enemy of creativity is habit. Habit is thinking without thinking. And remember, I said, as far as the brain is concerned, it's just neurochemical signals and pathways. No discrimination between bad habits and good habits, no discrimination against or between wise thinking and stupid thinking. no discrimination between doing something in a very effective way and an ineffective way. It's all the same. You get what you practice. You lay down the connections that you practice and repeat, and that's what gets easy. So it's important then to, in order to be creative, to have an attitude of creativity. And with regard to goals, of course, we can set them, but our relationship to them is very important. One relationship is acquisition, what I call acquisition. Acquisition is, I'm going to achieve that goal. And when we talk about it like that, the goal becomes something out there in the future that somehow we have to reach out and get. In other words, we're separate from it. It's there, we're here, and somehow we have to grab it. We have an idea of attraction as well. This is where you can attract goals, attract the things that you want, but it doesn't really help because the goal is still out there, and now instead of reaching out to grab it, you are trying to make it come to you. So same separation. Now, if you think about continually creating goals, this puts you in the driver's seat. This puts you as a creator, as an author of your own experience. This means that goals are continuous creativity. And instead of thinking, you know, I haven't got my goal yet, you're thinking every day, I am creating the reality of this goal that I want. And as I continue to do so, it will be fulfilled in sometime in the future. So that relationship to our goals, I think, is really important. And as coaches, the more we can encourage clients with that relationship, the better it is, because it'll lead to responsibility and feeling at the cause of their experience rather than at the victim of their experience. So then, what about this creativity and creative problem solving? A problem, basically, is the difference between where you are and where you want to be. If you are not where you want to be, you have a problem. It could be a big problem or a small problem, depending on how unpleasant it is where you are, or how attractive it is where you want to be, or how big a distance it is between them. But that's basically a problem. There's nothing bad about a problem. We're solving problems all the time. How do we solve them? That's the thing. Well, as I said, the part of our brain that's particularly involved in that is the prefrontal cortex, which is the part here, the executive, the CEO of the brain, as it were, the so-called higher cognitive functions of decision-making and planning. That's what's involved here. And in order to be creative, I'm taking the idea that we are naturally creative, and what we need to do is to move aside the barriers that we have. And one of the most important ways that the prefrontal cortex does that is not by coming up with, you know, fantastic, amazing, different ideas, but actually by inhibiting those things that can distract you. And sometimes we think of the prefrontal cortex as the firework display of the brain, but a lot of its job actually is putting out fires, actually inhibiting other things that could get in the way. Distractions, of course, you know, continuous distractions. Some distractions do need to be attended to, like you know, sudden pain or the smell of smoke. You do need to attend to those. But a lot of those distractions, oh, got to answer an email, oh, got to have a cup of coffee, oh, you know, I've got to phone so-and-so. It's your prefrontal cortex that goes, no, no, you don't. This is more important at the moment. What else does it inhibit? It inhibits system one thinking, because system one thinking is that quick emotional kind of programmed in ideas that we have about things that are so easy to fall into and yet can be so wrong and leads us to so many biases in our thinking, of which the most famous probably is the so-called confirmation bias, where we tend to see, notice and seek out the information and the facts and experiences that confirm what we already think, rather than seek out those things that are counterexamples. Thereby, if we continue to do this, we put ourselves more and more in a little bubble of we are right, we are right because of this, and this, and look at this evidence and everything else. Confirmation bias, it's very natural. There are many more. First of all, we've got to know them. We've got to know these tricks and traps of system one before we can actually combat them. And this is what we're going to be going into in the course to a large extent. Habits of action we need to inhibit, and particularly habits of thinking. I think it was Leonardo da Vinci that said, when I have a problem and I think of a solution, I never am satisfied with that first solution. I always try and think of two more, because the first thought out of your brain is going to be the one that has the most connections. It's the habitual thinking. It's the one that you're used to. Now, it may be very good. You may even end up by doing it. I'm not saying it's not okay. However, be aware that it will be the habitual one. It will be the path most trodden. It will be the path in your brain that has the most repetitions, the most connections, and therefore the one you fall into straight away, unless you make an effort to do something else. And this is the great blessing and sometimes the great curse of neuroplasticity. We are changing our brain all the time. This is how we learn. We make new connections. We deepen certain connections by repetition. And once we deepen them, we have a habit. And once we have a habit, that then happens automatically. And it's hard to get out of. So the habits that we formed become the enemies of our new thinking and the things that we want to do different. So in order to decide, to set goals, to achieve goals, we have to not only smooth over the connections that we've already made, but we have to make new connections. Okay. Now, one, of course, distraction is when we feel afraid or threatened or anxious. And this comes from a part of our brain known as the amygdala, which is Latin for almond, which is the nice little nuts that we eat, almonds, because it looks like an almond. And the amygdala is the seat of many of the strong emotions, particularly fear, because fear is what keeps us alive. If something is dangerous, we need to immediately react. But the amygdala can be kind of stimulated by perceived threat. It doesn't have to be a real threat. Our amygdala, and we feel anxious or afraid by anything that we perceive to be threatening based on our values and our experience. When that happens, it shuts down, to some extent, our prefrontal cortex. In other words, exactly when we need our best thinking is exactly the time when the amygdala starts making it difficult to get our best thinking. And one of the things that is so helpful in terms of being able to manage one's emotions and thinking is the connections between the amygdala and the prefrontal cortex. And one of the things you might be interested to know is that a meditation or mindfulness practice increases those connections in the brain and has a very well researched effects on emotional intelligence and being able to focus in the face of distraction, particularly emotional distraction. And when your amygdala feels threatened and it's hard to think, this is called an amygdala hijack. And as coaches, of course, or as anyone who are dealing with people in difficulties, we need to be particularly mindful of what we say, what we do, so that the person does not feel threatened. And we're not talking about physical threats here, we're simply sometimes talking about threats to values. You know, people's values feel threatened, and this is very emotional. So this is, might have a Latin name, and it might be a small part buried deep in the brain, but it's very, very important in practical terms. Okay. So let us carry on a little bit. The next is a little cartoon, which I like very much because it gives the paradox of the prefrontal cortex, here represented by Einstein, complete with brain, I'm sure, as a kind of nightclub bouncer. Because Einstein, yes, certainly has to think very clearly. At the same time, it needs to inhibit and keep out all of those kinds of distractions that are going to stop good work going on. So we have, I think the person hanging onto his legs is the amygdala, means the amygdala. Then we have kind of noisy distractions there with the street musician, and then the caveman is those kind of basic drives that we all have that can easily distract us when we're trying to think. Creativity needs focus. Yeah? Focus comes from the prefrontal cortex, and focus comes from the ability to inhibit and damp down all of those things that try and stop focus. Okay. So a quick resume so far. The brain is naturally creative. We are naturally creative, as long as we go along in brain-friendly ways. You know? We have these amazing minds that can and very often try to act in ways that go against us, go against our best interests, you know, physically and biologically. And it doesn't work. You know, we are basically human beings with a body and a brain. So work with it, not against it. Creativity is an attitude. Goal achievement is a process. And the success of it depends on the creation of habits. Because except with the most trivial and short term of goals, like reaching out for a glass of water, you're going to have to take time in order to be able to achieve those goals. And the habits are made and unmade through this ability of our brain to change, which is very much a double-edged sword because it lays down the connections that then keep us in those habits unless we can become aware of that and move to make other connections. So what about these habits? Well, if you are going to make a habit, and this goes for any kind of habit, whether it's a habit of something you need to do to achieve a goal, some habit of thinking, some habit of action, doesn't matter. We tend to concentrate too much sometimes on breaking habits, you know, bad habits. Really, we ought to concentrate more on making good ones, because if you make another habit, if you make another groove that's deeper than the last one, then that will be your new habit. To get a successful habit, it's got to be easy to remember. And this is where cues, reminders, so-called structures in coaching language, to help you remember when you need to remember, and context, you know, where you are so that it's helpful. Put yourself in a helpful situation. Don't try and make it more difficult than you have to. So easy to remember, linked to a value, no doubt about that. Emotion and attention will make the connections that you need to make in your brain for a habit more quickly and more deeply. And nobody quite understands how this happens, but paying attention to what you do does increase and make quicker the neuroplastic changes in your brain. Even though the neuroplastic changes are changes in real matter of neurons, and attention is, who knows, it's kind of hard to say what attention is, but we all know how to do it. There is a connection. Make it easy to start, small chunks at a time. Don't try and do the whole thing all at once. This is the big mistake. There are two ways to fail completely at goal achievement. One is to do nothing, of course, and the other is to try to do everything all at once, which is very often happens on these New Year's resolutions. You know, you're going to change your whole personality. You're going to completely eat differently, exercise differently, be a different person. It's not going to happen. One small thing at a time, one small success at a time builds success and rewards, celebrations, small celebrations. You know, it's easier to study with a series of small books than it is one great big book. Those are brain-friendly rules of successful habits. Okay. This is the Coaching the Brain, based on the book. There's 3 modules. Neuroscience of Goals, which is the one that's starting next week. There are 2 other modules that will be starting later in the year. Neuroscience of Values and the Neuroscience of Mental Models or Beliefs. Now, the Neuroscience of Goals, which is the one starting next week, runs for 7 weeks, 7 webinars. They're run for about an hour to an hour and a half, depending on what we're doing. There's a question and answer session. All the webinars are recorded. So if you miss or you want to go back on something, they are available. And there's a closed Facebook group to network with your colleagues who are also on the course. It has been awarded ICF CCEU points. There is a certificate from Lambent, UK, for each course. And there is an international coaching community certificate on the neuroscience of coaching for those of you that complete all 3. In other words, the goals module, the values module, and the beliefs module. There is, of course, a comprehensive course manual and plenty of action learning, tasks, some videos to watch, a few things to read, and some exploratory homework to do. We're going to cover how the brain works. We're going to cover in detail neuroplasticity, how the brain changes itself, how so-called cold cognition works, our logic, our thinking, the crucial abilities of your brain to be creative, what you can do to enhance creativity, how to avoid the default network. The default network is the name given to those brain structures that are humming away while you do nothing, or you think you're doing nothing. The brain is always doing something. I talked a bit about system 1, the tricks and the traps that stop us thinking clearly. So we need to know about those so we can deal with them. Priming and anchoring, these are the unconscious influences on our thinking in the environment and in the way that people frame questions. Extremely important that we know how to deal with those. And then I want to finish up with goals that are supposed to lead to happiness, you know, getting what you want. Well, maybe. And there are two types of happiness. And we don't want to be on the so-called hedonistic treadmill, which just means, well, as soon as we get one goal, it's on to the next one. You know, as soon as we pass one examination, that is simply your ticket to go on to the next examination. Get one goal and you move up to another one. That's no way to live. So we want to make sure that we don't get onto that sort of way of thinking. So we'll be going into all of those in our 7 weeks together. For your clients, well, better results for sure, creative strategies, and definitely understanding and avoiding the limited thinking, which most of the time we don't know we're doing. And for you, you will move from a problem solver to a problem dissolver. You dissolve problems. It's much more fun than solving problems. Framing your questions in a brain-friendly way, and of course, enhanced knowledge, enhanced reputation, more credibility, better results. Here's the final one. That's the normal price. There's an early bird price in the next week. If you are an ICC member, you've done an ICC course, you'll have a certificate and a membership number. You get 10% off if you can produce that. And that is the address for registration in the course. There it is. So that's pretty much what I want to cover. I hope it's been interesting and useful, and I hope that I'll see many of you on the course. And now I just want to spend a few minutes that we have left with any comments or questions from anybody who's been listening. So please feel free to type in comments and questions into the chat box, and I will respond to those.